Welcome everyone to the Garrod seminar series on rethinking past globalization, hosted by the MacDonald Institute at the University of Cambridge. In the course of this series, we've heard several different voices from scholars in several different disciplines on their perspective of different perspectives on globalization in the past, what it means, how to identify it, and its different manifestations. And today I am delighted to introduce Sureshkumar, who will talk to us about crop migrations as a globalizing process, the case of tropical Asian crops in ancient East-West networks. Sureshkumar is an historian of the ancient world and lecturer in history at the National University of Singapore. He's author of the just published book, The Tropical Turn, Agricultural Innovation in the Ancient Middle East and Mediterranean, with the UC Press. And I can personally vouch for and recommend the book. And hopefully we will hear a bit more about that tonight and how East-West crop exchange relates to globalization in the past. So over to you, Suresh.
So let me get started. Thank you for joining me. It's afternoon for you, but it's just past midnight here in Singapore. So I apologize in advance if I sound a bit groggy. So this is going to be the agenda for today. I'm going to be looking at globalizing frameworks to begin with. I mean, some of the speakers in the series before have kind of touched on this, so I'm not going to spend too much time on, globalizing frameworks in relation to how they're applied to studies on antiquity. And then I'm going to move on to the sort of meat of what I'm discussing today, crop migrations being as a kind of globalizing process. And more specifically talking about glocalization, that's the regionalization of these different crops that are moving across long distances. And finally, addressing questions of agency. A lot of globalization narratives tend to privilege traders, merchants, like they're very commerce-centric, but I would say that that is not the case, especially where crops are concerned. A lot of other people display mobility and are capable of moving vegetal materials across long distances. So I'm a strong advocate for moving away from these commerce-centric models of globalization. Okay, let's start off with globalizing frameworks. Now, as a noun, globalization is attested in English from the 1930s. Probably comes from the French, which is attested slightly earlier. It was a new word coined by Pierre de Coubertin in 1904. Incidentally, he's also the founder of the modern Olympic Games. But it's only meaningfully adopted in the social sciences and humanities from around the 80s onwards, but really from the 90s onwards. Initially, it's used to explain, 16th century and polities and the modern world system from the 16th century onwards. And has a pronounced focus on the economy, especially the development of free market capitalism. Now, it's been increasingly applied to pre-modern periods. People regularly speak of global antiquity or the global Middle Ages and so on. And broadly speaking, they're characterized by a focus on increasing connectivity and all kinds of integrative processes like the flows of peoples, crops, animals, specific aspects of material culture, could be a gemstone or technologies, the spread of languages, and all kinds of ideas, including religions. So, and it's kind of become a buzzword, like, it's the literature on globalization in relation to the pre-modern world has become quite overwhelming, but it's not always meaningfully deployed in a lot of these narratives. I mean, there are a lot of times I've read a journal paper with globalization in the title, but by the time you get to the last paragraph, you realize that the whole thing has just been about the Mediterranean. I think they were really intending to speak about regionalization rather than globalization. So, a lot of critics of globalization tend to say that, it's just being thrown in as a catchy buzzword and it's not being deployed in a meaningful way. On a more practical level, there have been lots of sort of interdisciplinary research centers, marketing themselves as sort of, global antiquity experts or programs or seminar series like this one, which focus on, globalization and antiquity. There are also modules that are focused on global history. Very often they tend to deal with periods from the 16th century onwards. But as I said earlier, there's an increasing number of people who are applying globalization as a concept to the Middle Ages, antiquity. Yeah. So essentially, we need to ask ourselves if this is a useful meta-narrative, especially in the context of Afro-Eurasian antiquity, which is what I'm concerned with here. It has mixed reactions in the field. I mean, the proponents tend to say that, yes, it's an anachronistic framework, but it's still helping us ask the important questions in uncovering, interconnectivities between various cultures in antiquity, which is all the more important given how divided the field is in modern scholarship. Especially in, say, ancient history, it tends to be practiced in, disciplines that are quite insular, whether it's classics or Assyriology or Indology and so on. And people don't seem to be so, easily clued into the connection, the sort of connectivity between these regions. Some people tend to prefer to speak rather of a proto-globalization because it's a spatially limited process. It's clearly not involving the Americas. And others, prefer using the verbal form, globalizing, because it seems to suggest an ongoing process as opposed to something that's completed. So in my book, I only use globalizing twice, and it's only the verbal form, and I make it clear that I'm using it in retrospect as well. The detractors of globalization narratives tend to point out that it's basically a teleological history, that there is an underlying assumption that connectivity is a good thing, and that, we are in some sort of linear, inexorable, progress towards increased connectivity. And very often the kinds of globalization narratives that are focused on sort of cultural diffusion, they fall back on these center-periphery models, which have their own weaknesses. But there is a growing acknowledgement that globalization is a complex phenomenon. It's clearly not a linear and inexorable process. Networks are constantly waxing and waning through time. There are lots of spatial and temporal differences in connectivity. I mean, in the context of, say, South Asia and the Middle East, for example, the late 3rd millennium BCE was a period of high connectivity, and then there's sort of a rupture when the surface copper deposits in Oman are gone, and the Harappan civilization collapses, and then for several hundred years you don't have so much of that direct contact, and it's really towards the end of the Bronze Age and into the Iron Age when we get more vibrant trade connections through the Persian Gulf leading into South Asia. There's also growing recognition that globalization as a phenomenon coexists with local diversity. Global trends are very often reproduced to support local needs. It's often called localization, the global becoming local. This is quite apparent in the case of crops in particular, as I will demonstrate in a bit. It's often the case that the crops are not used in the way that they in the way that they're treated back in their homelands. And I'll give you a few examples for this later on. And globalization narratives in antiquity are also paying increasing attention to some of the detrimental aspects of this connectivity. So that there isn't always this assumption that connectivity is simply a good thing. It does have, some negative effects as well, whether it's resource depletion, the creation of wealth inequality, and more importantly, the spread of pathogens and disease and the impact that they have on public health. During the COVID-19 crisis, there was actually an upsurge of ancient historians and archaeologists interested in the history of pandemics. You had long blog posts on the Black Plague and the Justinian Plague and so on. But then there are also scholars who use globalizing paradigms without invoking the word globalization or globalizing in any way. Instead, they use alternative sort of frameworks to conceptualize long-distance connections between states, societies, and cultures. So one idea that I find particularly interesting is that of the linguistic cosmopolis. It was popularized by Sheldon Pollock in his 2009 book, which developed this idea of a Sanskrit cosmopolis, wherein Sanskrit was used as a language of political expression, both in South and Southeast Asia. So it has since been applied to a lot of other languages. Basically, we're talking about a language that's used across a wide geographic area for specific purposes of communications or for political and religious expression. But the problem with this model is that it tends to privilege, hegemonic cultures, and also, it focuses overwhelmingly on languages that are written down. So it leaves out the subaltern, so to speak. But I'm going to be adapting this model for my own understanding of crop movement, so I'll come back to this later on. Some people speak of connectivity through the means of interaction spheres. So different scholars have proposed, different sorts of interaction spheres. This is kind of a compromise between globalization and regionalization. It's recognizing that there are specific interaction spheres in particular periods of time. So Gregory Purcell, for example, speaks of the Middle Asian interaction sphere for the Bronze Age. So this kind of extends from, say, Central Asia all the way to the Mediterranean. The other scholars have spoken of a Mediterranean interaction sphere or an East Asian interaction sphere. A variation of this is oikomenization, borrowing from the Greek word for the inhabited world. It's kind of similar to an interaction sphere as well, mostly applied to Hellenistic and Roman polities. And then finally, you have scholars talking about connectivity in terms of diffusion and exchange, be they cultural, biological, political, or otherwise, involving both state and non-state actors. So these are just some examples of books dealing with, globalizing paradigms, but without necessarily invoking or giving or privileging, globalization, the word. Okay, so let's move on to crop migration, specifically as a globalization process. Now, it's not the case that crops are traveling in a package. The actual transmission process is very complex. It's spatially and temporally uneven. We have transmissions, moving across Eurasia in the Bronze Age, in the Iron Age, even into the, historic periods. And it's an episodic process that is bringing together these previously isolated crop cultures. And it's multi-directional, and it involves more than just comestible crops. So it's not just the usual grains, pulses, tubers, but also fiber and oil plants like cotton, for example, which is a domesticate of South Asia and moves to the Middle East by the first millennium BCE. There are lots of aromatics and spices, but the problem is that the spices often don't grow especially the tropical ones don't grow in the temperate zone. So Pliny, for example, tells us that Seleucus, one of the Hellenistic kings, experimented with growing some of these tropical spices in Syria, but it didn't quite work out. There are also ornamental plants and fruits and vegetables that are being transported across long distances. So these could be protracted processes, or they could be relatively quick. There's an interesting case in Pliny the Elder's text of a Indian millet. We don't quite know what it is, but based on the description, it sounds a bit like sorghum. And Pliny tells us that it was introduced into Roman Italy in a span of about 10 years. And that's one of the rare specific references that we get to, like, a long distance crop migration and how it's integrated into local agriculture in a span of time. Otherwise, most of the time we are left with disparate records, both archaeological and textual, and we kind of do piece them up together. My sense for a lot of crops is that we're dealing with introductions and reintroductions. There's a long history of crop failures that often gets ignored. And crop movers themselves are a diverse lot. As I explained right at the beginning, these narratives tend to privilege, like, traders moving across long distances, but there are lots of other people, moving long distances in antiquity, and we'll come back to agency right at the end. Okay, just a sense of like some of the crop movements. There are lots of east-west horizontal movements, but of north-south movements as well. The most notable ones are like, wheat, barley, flax that are traveling from Southwest Asia, in both directions, eastwards and westwards. And you get, African millets and sorghum from East Africa traveling into South Asia as well. Some of these processes are not particularly well documented, both textually and archaeologically. If you think about African millets and sorghum, for example, the evidence for them on the Arabian Peninsula is quite poor, to an extent that some scholars have proposed that they have moved directly from Africa to India in the early second millennium BCE. But to me, that doesn't appear historically cogent. That there's no evidence for that sort of direct contact between East Africa and India in the early second millennium BCE. I do see Arabia as sort of a mediator, but it's just that, our current evidence in terms of archaeology for these millets and sorghum is pretty weak for the second millennium BCE. And there's, of course, East Asian crops like broomcorn millet, there are a whole bunch of them. Like the apple, apricots, peaches, hemp, pistachios, carrots, they're moving from a Central Asian and East Asian milieu into Europe. The African millets I've just remarked, so these include sorghum, finger millet, pearl millet, hyacinth bean, cowpea, and castor. So a lot of these are tested in South Asia by sort of the early second millennium BCE. Some of them might have even got there slightly earlier in the Harappan period, but the evidence is not directly dated, so it's still a bit dodgy. The crop migration that I'm most familiar with, because I've written an entire book about this, is of course the migration of tropical and subtropical crops from South and Southeast Asia to the Middle East and the Mediterranean. It's been labeled variously in the literature, most famously as the medieval Green Revolution or the Arab Agricultural Revolution by Andrew Watson. I, of course, call it the tropical turn. I don't quite like the word revolution because it implies a relatively quick process, whereas a turn could be slow or quick. And as I explained earlier, the processes of transmission, differ from crop to crop. And it's been described by some scholars like Andrew Sherrod as one of the most important movement of crops before the Columbian exchange. Now, I would put a caveat here because this particular crop exchange seems particularly important because a lot of the areas that are involved in this crop transmission have left written records. So, it seems that, this particular movement of crops is much more prominent, much more important than, say, crop transmissions happening in areas where there weren't, where literacy levels were pretty much non-existent. So some of the crops that are moving across these regions include sesame, which gets to the Middle East by the late 3rd millennium BCE. So it's one of the earliest in this batch of crops. There's domesticated melon, but that has more than one center of domestication. There's also an African center for that. There's rice, cotton, cucumbers, different types of citruses, but in antiquity we're mostly dealing with the citron and the lemon. The sacred lotus, taro, and also a semi-domesticated kind of tree crop called sisu, and so on. So that just gives you a sense of like the complexity of these different crop migrations. And bear in mind that they're happening in different periods of time. As I said, we have Bronze Age transmissions, Iron Age transmissions, and also stuff that goes on well into the early historic period. So we're really, for some of these crops, we're really dealing with multiple introductions. Okay, so what was the impact of this crop globalization? Now, it's twofold. The first was that it resulted in the creation of what Alan Mikhail, an Ottoman historian, calls the unified ecological context zone with overlapping sets of cultivars and livestock. So what this essentially means is that if you are a person living in, say, 500 BCE, if you had the opportunity to visit both ends of Eurasia, chances are you would find crops and animals that were somehow familiar to you. Essentially, agrarian landscape, it's not a homogenization of agrarian landscapes, but rather, increasing familiarity of specific elements in the agrarian landscape throughout Afro-Eurasia. And it also led to the creation of a substrate on which intercultural transfers were facilitated, namely that is essentially, this sort of commonality that's being built by the crop cultures served as a platform for, further cultural and technological transmission. I have sort of proposed that we can call this a kind of Afro-Eurasian eco-language. So I'm borrowing again from the linguistic cosmopolis model, which I explained earlier. And this eco-language can be defined as a growing coherence in agrarian practices and consumptive cultures across Afro-Eurasia. So things like normalizing a multi-cropping cycle. So, summer cropping becomes very normal in a Middle East and Mediterranean context in the 1st millennium BCE. The widespread use of irrigation, and this is quite necessary for a lot of these summer crops that are being adopted. The adoption of garden, orchard arboriculture, and related technologies like grafting for citrus fruits. And this model, I think, is flexible enough to accommodate regional variations in crop usage. That's globalization. I'll come back to that in a bit. So one case study that appeals in particular to me with regards to how, crop transmissions can serve as a platform for, cultural and political coalescence is the so-called Indianization of Southeast Asia, which is actually, so before the transmission of Buddhism, Hinduism, and all the sort of Indic political models, which heavily influenced Southeast Asian culture, this was preceded by centuries of converging agrarian practices and foodways, including, for example, the adoption of indica rice, which displaced the japonica variety that was more common in mainland Southeast Asia. Mung bean, hyacinth bean, and sesame, these are some of the other Indian domesticates that are coming into Southeast Asia. The development of a very specific garden and orchard cultivation culture, including the likes of both South and Southeast Asian fruits like mango, banana, jackfruit or breadfruit, areca nuts, coconut, citruses, and also spices like pepper, turmeric, and ginger, which of course become very lucrative down to more recent periods of history. And of course, the keeping of zebu cattle as well for dairy and traction. So in the context of the Mediterranean and the Middle East, which is the region that my book was concerned with, you have, of course, as I said earlier, this normalization of multiple cropping, the extension of the growing season, and this sort of expanded number of crops, summer crops that were available to the cultivator in the first millennium BCE. There's increased dietary diversity, especially in comparison to what was being consumed in the Neolithic and early Bronze Age phases. But in most places, the impact was not quite palpable. With Neolithic staple foods, especially barley, continued to dominate agriculture in most parts of the Middle East. It changes in some areas like the Caspian. I'll talk a bit more about that in a bit. And this is also kind of ironic because modern globalization tends to be accused of like promoting monocultures and killing off diversity and local varieties of crops. But in a first millennium BC context, it certainly seems to have added to dietary diversity. So it's also a calorific and marketable surplus because now you've got summer cropping of these newly arrived crops. But who's benefiting from this? In some cases, these crop migrations seem to have had some sort of leveling effect. In fact, they may have been adopted by cultivators who wanted to reclaim previously marginal environments, like rice seems to be doing that for some of the marsh regions in Babylonia, but perhaps also as a means of evading taxation regimes in the Middle East, which were focused on traditional grain crops like wheat and barley. But new crops could also be integrated into the state's rationing regime, and they could also intensify exploitative labor practices, because many of these, as I said earlier, are labor and water intensive, and they involve landscape modifying activities like building bunds on rice fields. And if we think about the introduction of a lot of these tropical crops to the Americas, for example, in the early modern period, rice, cotton, sugarcane, and indigo, a lot of them were tied to slave labor. And we should imagine that, that must have been pretty similar in antiquity as well. These are really labor intensive crops. And the other impact of crop globalization that is notable is the spread of pests and plant pathogens. There's an interesting and growing body of paleoentomological evidence for all kinds of insects that are coming from the east, but they've not yet been meaningfully correlated with specific crop movements. So there's a lot of avenue for further research in this field. So in my book, I kind of just referred to this phenomenon in passing and make notice of some of these insects like the red flower beetle, the lesser grain borer, the capra beetle, and so on. I also have a small part in my cucumber chapter about the appearance of a cucurbit beetle that seems to be a particular concern in Akkadian texts of the first millennium BCE. So I think this is a really interesting area of research, looking at the arrival of pests and trying to correlate them with the introduction of particular crops. Or in some cases, they seem to be traveling with farinaceous products rather than the plants themselves. So the other aspect that we need to pay attention to when we're talking about crop globalization is localization. That's the, adapting these crops and the way they're used to a sort of local cultural milieu. In many cases, despite the fact that these crops, are being diffused across long distances, they are only consumed in ways that are familiar to the people who have adopted them. And modes of consumption also vary quite a bit depending on social status, gender, age, mobility, and locality. So Plutarch, who lived in the late 1st century CE, has this interesting comment about how a lot of older people still cannot eat ripe cucumber, citron, or pepper. And notice these are all Indian cultivars. So cultural preferences played a really strong role in food acceptability. And I would say that, you know, the crop failures and like delays in adoption, many of them are probably, you know, connected to, you know, local perceptions of the utility of this crop and its cultural worth as well. So let's look at 2 case studies. I have rice, you know, which even in Asia, the way it's consumed, it's kind of variable. And the typology of rice is also varied. So in parts of East and Southeast Asia, for example, there's a distinct preference for sticky and glutinous rice. I just came back from Laos a week ago, and it's very striking that in most parts of the middle Mekong region, a lot of people do still prefer sticky rice. The same thing happens in antiquity. When rice arrives in the Middle East and the Mediterranean, it's initially processed and consumed as bread, cake, or porridge. Now, rice is not the best grain for making bread unless you are kind of like gluten intolerant, but that was what was familiar in terms of the consumptive culture in the Middle East and the Mediterranean. So not surprising that it's consumed in that form, as opposed to, say, boiled grain, which was the norm across most parts of Asia, or rather the zones from which it originates from. So despite the fact that there are divergences in the way they're being consumed in these regions, one thing that is really striking when I look at rice cultures is how they tend to develop a sort of similar cultural attitude to other grain crops, namely a kind of disdain for products of wheat and barley. Now, the question of whether this was an inherited attitude that came along with crop diffusion, or whether it's a case of cultural convergence, is still something that I'm ruminating on, and I don't have a clear answer to this. But the perceived cultural superiority of rice in rice-eating cultures is very well attested in Chinese and Indian contexts. In fact, in some Sanskrit lexicons, wheat is classified as food for the barbarians, blecha bhojanam. Now, that's really interesting, even in the Indian context, because there's a lot of wheat that's being consumed in India, especially in the northwestern parts. But in China, is of course, the case that rice is always used as a yardstick for measuring some kind of civilizational capacity. So if you read Chinese ethnographies or Chinese histories, one recurring question that you always find there is whether or not a particular group of peoples consumed rice. It's kind of tantamount to asking if they were civilized. Now, it's interesting that we see this attitude developing in parts of the Middle East where rice was adopted as a staple crop as well, most notably in the Caspian zone. So this is like sort of Gilan province in modern-day Iran, the southern Caspian zone in particular. And over the past 1,000 years, there have been tons of anecdotes about how people perceived rice to be superior vis-a-vis wheat and barley. So Ibn Hokal, a 10th century Arab geographer, for example, talks about how people in this region were so used to eating rice bread that they suffered terrible colics and even died from consuming wheat. Clearly an exaggeration. But this disdain for wheat, continues to be reported down the centuries to modern times. So there is a report from the early 20th century which talks about how the Gilak, which is the ethnic group that inhabits this region, does not eat bread but regards it as unsuitable food for its constitution, to the extent that an angry husband says to his wife, "Go eat bread and die," i.e. wheaten bread. And again, we have another anecdote from around 1830 where parents in this region are threatening to send their kids away to a region beyond the mountains where people would be eating wheaten bread. That's the ultimate punishment, so to say, in this culture. Now, something similar happens again in other cultures that are adopting rice. In Iron Age South India, for example, I have a recent paper on this. And here, native millets are being displaced by rice, which is coming down from the Gangetic Valley. And it's by the Iron Age, it becomes the leading crop. And millets, despite being indigenous to this region, are seen as inferior to rice by elite populations. And rice functions as sort of a yardstick for wealth in a way that millets never did. Another case of globalization that's interesting in my case is mung bean. Now, it's not in my book, but it's something I've been thinking about for quite some time. It's interesting because it's traveling in both directions. It goes westwards to the Red Sea region, and it's also going eastwards to Southeast Asia, to China. There's recent archaeological discovery of mung beans from a 6th century site in Taiwan as well. I'll show you a picture of that in a bit. So in the West, mung beans are tested in the context of the Roman Red Sea ports, Mayos Hormos, Qusayr al-Qadim, and Berenike, where some 70 beans were found. Now, they seem to be part of the foodstuffs that were brought along by a South Indian trading diaspora because they were found in relation to rice and Indian ceramics. The same seems to be the case with the mung beans that are being found in peninsular Thailand. These are slightly earlier. They're from the late centuries BCE. Again, they're found in association with Indian ceramics, suggesting that these migrants are bringing these foodstuffs along with them. So I think I forgot to say this, that the mung bean is an Indian domesticate. So these are the sites in Thailand, Pukaltong and Kalsam Keo. Now, the interesting thing about mung beans is that they're a complete failure in the West. Nobody, picks up on the presence of this crop, or it may have been noticed, but been purposefully ignored. But that's not the case in Southeast Asia, where it's taken up enthusiastically. But later on in China as well. So you can see the mung beans that were recently discovered in Taiwan on the screen. But the way they were consumed were quite different from the way they were consumed back home in India. In India, mung beans tend to be, processed into like savory foods, a kind of dal dish, or incorporated into rice dishes. Whereas in East Asia and in Southeast Asia, they tend to be processed into flour and used in sweet pastries and noodles like the one you see in the screen. Or they are also consumed as bean sprouts. So again, we have a case of globalization here. As I said, in the West, they were completely ignored despite being brought over there, at least by the Roman period. So it's quite clear that, crop cultivation histories feature multiple failures, purposeful disregard, which I think is the case for mung bean in the West, and abandonment in some cases, which is what happens to the sacred lotus in Egypt. And they kind of demonstrate that these crop migrations are not linear processes in any way. Okay, globalization, finally, I would say also involves the process of indigenization. What I mean by that is that the crop gains very specific social, symbolic, and cultural meanings, which you don't find in its place of origin. The citron, which is native to India, is a really good example of this. It acquires religious values in Judaism and Levantine Christianity. In fact, it's particularly associated with the Jewish feast of Sukkot. There was a recent BBC article which talked about how a particular Jewish group maintained intimate links with Calabrian farmers because they thought that the best citrons were being produced in the south of Italy. But a lot of these cultural features gained by the citron are very Mediterranean specific. You don't find them back where they come from. So finally, moving on to the question of agency. As I said, a lot of globalizing narratives, commerce-centric. I think that's a pretty lazy response to explaining connectivity. Yes, there were traders who were moving vegetal materials throughout history, but there were also lots of people who engaged in transactional processes without necessarily identifying as professional traders. I mean, you could be selling your summer surplus produce in the local bazaar. That does not make you a trader. So there are lots of people who engage in short-range exchange, especially where it concerns fresh produce. And don't self-identify as traders in any meaningful way. And long-distance trade is also, not as common as we think it might be the case. I mean, it's high risk, high capital input activity, and not all cultures in antiquity had a class of people who called themselves traders and engaged in long-distance trade. I would say that any historical actor who is endowed with any kind of mobility should be considered as being capable of moving all kinds of vegetal and biotic materials. This includes the likes of diplomats, bureaucrats, scribes, physicians, soldiers, refugees, deportees. I think that's a very important class of people. If you think about, the history of the first millennium BCE in the Middle East, I mean, the Assyrian Empire kind of, pioneers these massive deportations that are then taken on by the Neo-Babylonian and Achaemenid empires as well. Slaves, moving around in great distances. There's a Babylonian cuneiform document that has a record of a slave that comes all the way from Gandhara and what is northwest India. Pilgrims, colonists, fisherfolk, pastoralists, these peoples who are traditionally very mobile to begin with, cooks, craftsmen, all kinds of professionals, and there's very good evidence for them in historical records, especially in the Assyrian and Achaemenid periods. Even brides and bridegrooms moving across substantial distances. And there's often the claim that, people are pretty conservative with what they consume, but I would say that that's a good reason for why crops are moving as well. So when people do move, when let's say they're deported or they're colonists, as is the case with, say, for example, the Greek settlers in Hellenistic Egypt, they perceived Greek varieties of crops like cabbage, chickpeas, figs, and garlic to be superior to the Egyptian ones. It's not the case that Egypt was lacking in any of these crops, but there was a certain crop branding and cultural association that made them perceive the Greek varieties of the same crop to be superior to the Egyptian ones, which led them to importing these varieties, despite the fact that Egypt already had a lot of these crops. And the last part that I'd like to address in terms of agency is, attributing, these crop migrations to specific historical political actors like the Romans, the Achaemenid or the Sasanian Persians, or the Islamic Arabs, as Andrew Watson does in his book. Now, I'm not denying the importance of imperial agency. It does seem to be important for the movement of some crops. There's a lot of experimentation that takes place in the context of the palace garden. The plants themselves are kind of seen as an extension of empire for some of these polities. So when Sennacherib, for example, is growing cotton in 7th century BC Assyria, he's basically making a political statement. A lot of people take that passage about cotton out of context, but when you read the whole passage, it's quite clear that he is trying to imitate the landscape of southern Babylonia, which from an Assyrian perspective is a politically problematic region. So, what he's doing is basically a symbolic subjugation of this landscape, but it also tells us that from an Assyrian perspective, cotton is a diagnostic plant of southern Babylonia. And there's actually a lot of evidence for cotton in southern Babylonia. It's only recently that the word for cotton was identified in Akkadian records. If you're interested in that, my book has a whole chapter in that. So yes, imperial agency is crucial for some crops, but not all of them. And a lot of crop migration narratives do tend to be, underlain by this sort of status paradigm. But as I alluded to earlier, a lot of these new crops are also not in the taxation system. They're not being taxed by the state. That seems to suggest that the state was not necessarily interested in these crops in the earliest phases, at least. On the other hand, some of them are incorporated into rationing systems, and there does seem to be an element of coercion. There's actually a fragmentary Assyrian letter which invokes rice, but in the same letter contains a record of the peasants cultivating it, fleeing the fields. It's not quite clear what the context is, but I would like to interpret it in the context of some kind of state coercion. So the state does take on these new cultivars and integrates it into its rationing system at some point, but it's not the case for all of the crops. So essentially the point is crop histories are complex. Agency that brought them there was complex as well. Okay, that's about much as I have right now. So thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you, Suresh. That was a wonderful talk. And we will indeed have a Q&A session. I have a few people joining me for a screening now, and anyone on the webinar is invited to type in your questions for Suresh. Questions here?
Do you want me to start?
Yes, we have one from the live screening audience. Do you want to come up and show your face when you're okay? No? Okay. Actually, we're not showing our faces, so just come close to the computer so we can hear you.
Hi, Suresh. That was absolutely fascinating. Really good. So My question actually is to do with the status of people who take on these crops and start cultivating them, whether you think it's more higher status people who tend to do it, or whether it's more spread out and or more low level cultivators. Do you want a bit more context why I'm asking that?
It seems to be very mixed, and it differs from crop to crop as well. So when the word that I identify as rice, and some other cuneiform scholars do as well, kurangu in Akkadian records, the first time it appears is at Tel Bari in the Middle Euphrates region. And it's sort of very casual reference, and the people growing it are not necessarily of any high status. So some of these crop introductions seem to be relatively invisible because they're being taken up by cultivators who are not high status. That also seems to be the case with taro, which historically has been seen as sort of the poor man's crop. But in some other cases, it's clearly starting off with some kind of like royal experimentation, or there's a lot of state attention that's being paid. That seems to be the case with cotton. In fact, it seems to be kind of like royal and temple monopoly, at least until the Neo-Babylonian period. It's only then where we get wider references to cotton in the cuneiform record.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. That makes sense.
Okay, I see something in the Q&A here. Let me open it up. Okay, there's a question. It looks like Mark Nesbitt is preparing a question for you. So while he does that, I wanted to ask you about chronology, because you talked about the Watson thesis, the Islamic Green Revolution, and how you show in your book that many of the crops that Watson identified as representing this Islamic Green Revolution were introduced much earlier, whether in the first millennium BCE or even the third millennium BCE into, say, Mesopotamia, Middle East, Mediterranean, Middle East more generally. Do you see any kind of long-term trends in maybe the intensity or variety of crops, of crop exchange, and if so, what are they? And also, how does all this ultimately relate to people's diets, the diversity of people's diets you mentioned earlier? Does an increased diversity in evidence for crops necessarily translate to increased dietary breadth? And how could we, gauge that rigorously?
I would say that a lot of this, especially in the first millennium BC context, is really spatially uneven. Some places seem to have better access to these crops and were more enthusiastic in picking them up. So there is this record from early Hellenistic period, or rather, just after Alexander's death, when these different generals were contending for power in Babylonia and Susiana. And there's a record of Seleucus and Pithon, the satraps of Babylon and Media, going into Susiana, and they were said to be without food, and the only thing they subsisted on was dates, sesame, and rice, which was said to grow plenty. And historically, this region has been a very important rice-growing region, and it seems to have become an important staple in pockets of that region as early as the late first millennium BCE. But elsewhere, it's like completely unknown. So there's a anecdote by an Arab historian about how Peninsular Arabs encountered a sack of rice during the invasion of the Sasanian Empire, and they thought it was basically, poison left behind by the enemy. So they had never seen rice. They had no idea what it was. So it seems that, knowledge of these crops was incredibly uneven. The same thing with dietary diversity. So what happens in the Islamic period is really an intensification. More people are exposed to this. And previously it used to be, most of these crops, tend to be confined to, I would say, Babylonia and the Eastern Mediterranean, and they only start making an impact in the Western Mediterranean in the Islamic period.
Okay, great. We have a couple questions in Q&A and chat on this issue of agency. Martin Jones writes as follows: Thanks for a great talk. I'm convinced you're right about dispersed agency, but in the earliest periods, what kind of dispersed agency among, in quotes, ordinary people? Would this be transactions between strangers? How mediated?
So there's a element of us prescribing what constitutes ordinary people here, like, and that really differs from, period to period, from space to space. That there is a lot of movement of ordinary people in the first millennium BCE. That much I can say for sure, and they do appear in the historical record. I mean, it's usually because these people are moved against their will as well. So I talked about slaves, deportees, and these are really massive ones. Entire groups of people are uprooted and brought to a completely alien landscape, and they bring with them their own food cultures. There are also lots of soldiers that are in the Achaemenid period that are being hired from across the empire. So we have Babylonian documents that attest to the billeting of soldiers from Caria, from India, from Lydia, from Egypt, from all across the empire, really. And that must have really promoted vibrant culinary culture, and they must have brought their crops with them as well, as I pointed out in the case of Greek settlers in Egypt. But unfortunately, it's not really reflected in the cuneiform tradition of that period, which becomes a bit more insular.
Okay, and also picking up on this theme, Mark Nesbitt writes, I was impressed by your nuanced approach to actors and motivation in crop movements. There are lots of parallels with modern colonial movements of crops, e.g. via Kew, where I work. Do you think your approach has something to offer historians of colonial botany?
I certainly hope it does. There's a lot of one thing that they might share in common with, say, 19th century botanists is that there definitely was a sort of, spirit of exploration and discovery. There was a genuine interest in, uncovering new crops, especially on the part of elites. As I explained earlier, there was also a political dimension to that. They saw collecting plants as sort of an extension of imperial activity. And then there certainly is a parallel to that with what's happening in the 19th century, the development of botanical gardens and so on. And in fact, many people describe Assyrian gardens of the first millennium BCE as kind of like a prototype for like modern botanical gardens. And there's so many plants listed in these inscriptions. Half of them, we have no idea what they are. There are no cognates in other Semitic languages.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point about the forgotten crops of ancient texts and ancient societies, which we can't even identify. So Mark says thanks and would love to discuss more. Nick says thanks for your talk. I would also just like to bring to your attention the East African coast and the evidence for the introduction and adoption of rice. There, the coastal Swahili, who are involved in Indian Ocean trade, are slowly adopting rice alongside the introduction of Islam. Also as part of creating social difference between them, the Swahili and other ethnic communities living along the coast and in the hinterland. The Sea Links project also used the prevalence of rice versus millet to trace the early settlement of East African islands by African communities, millet, and by Indonesian communities settling Madagascar and Comoros, rice. Basically using food preference as proxies for cultural background. The work was done by Sarah Walshaw and Alison Crowther. So I guess more of a comment than a question, but if you would like to comment on that, feel free.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I'm not as well versed in this particular case, but it seems to parallel what I've been saying about Southeast Asia as well, where certain cultural preferences and the adoption of, say, Hinduism or Buddhism is dictating what variety of crops are being used in that particular context. So here there seems to be a kind of Islamic package that's spread across the Indian Ocean rim.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? Okay, thank you, Suresh, very much for joining us despite the late hour. Yes, in Singapore now. And as you saw, I think you've stimulated a lot of thoughts and discussion for us. And I'm sure you'll be hearing more from us and others in the audience.